My name is Lily Hart, and on the day my life was supposed to end, I was 20 years old. That wasn't an ending in a dramatic, final sense, of course, but the end of the only life I had managed to build for myself. For 2 years, the Sterling estate had been my entire world. It was more than a job. It was my home, my sanctuary, the only stable ground I had ever known since aging out of the foster care system with nothing but a cheap suitcase and a well-rehearsed, brittle smile. I had no family, no trust fund, no safety net woven from generations of privilege. I had only my own 2 hands and a desperate, gnawing need to be useful, to be invisible enough not to be a problem, yet competent enough to be indispensable. It was a tightrope I had walked every single day, and that morning I had finally fallen. The summons had come without warning. A crisp, impersonal request from one of the household staff to present myself in Mr. Sterling's study at 10 o'clock sharp. The study was a place I had only ever seen from the hallway, a dark wood-panelled cavern of leather and old money that always smelled faintly of cigars and self-importance. I spent the hour before the meeting in an agony of speculation, my mind racing through every task I'd performed in the last month. Had I pruned the heirloom roses too aggressively? Was there a weed I had missed in the vast expanse of the English garden? Had my work grown sloppy? I didn't think so. I poured my soul into that garden. It was the only beautiful thing I had ever been allowed to tend. When I arrived, my work boots were meticulously cleaned, but they still felt like clumsy, oafish intruders on the priceless Aubusson rug. Mr. Alistair Sterling III sat behind a desk the size of my first apartment. He was a man who had inherited his father's fortune and his grandfather's jawline, but none of the character that was rumoured to have built the empire in the first place. He was handsome in the way a marble statue is handsome, cold, perfect, and utterly devoid of warmth. He didn't look up when I entered. He was signing papers with a heavy gold pen, the scratching sound loud in the oppressive silence of the room. "Miss Hart," he said, his voice clipped and bored. He still hadn't made eye contact. He was addressing a space somewhere to my left. "Your employment at this estate is terminated. Effective immediately." The words didn't feel real. They were just sounds, hanging in the air like dust motes in a sunbeam. I felt my lungs seize, a cold fist clenching around my heart. "Mr. Sterling? I don't understand. Did I do something wrong?" He finally looked up, his eyes a pale, uninterested blue. It was the look one might give a piece of furniture that was being replaced. "Your performance is no longer required. The gardens are being redesigned. We're outsourcing the maintenance to a corporate landscaping firm." He gestured vaguely toward the window, a more professional aesthetic. The implication was clear. I was unprofessional. Me, who had memorized the Latin names of every flower, who knew the precise pH balance of the soil in every bed, who had spent countless unpaid hours nursing delicate orchids back to health in the greenhouse. The corporate landscapers would come with their gas-powered leaf blowers and their chemical sprays, and they would sterilize the soul right out of the place. "I see," I whispered. My voice was a thread. "My things, my room is in the staff quarters. My housing was tied to the job. I had nowhere else to go." "You have until noon to vacate the premises," he said, already looking back down at his papers. The gold pen resumed its scratching. "Security will escort you to your quarters to ensure a swift and orderly departure." Dismissed, like a child. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that crept up my neck and burned behind my eyes. I wanted to scream, to protest, to demand a reason, severance, anything. But I knew it would be useless. You don't argue with men like Alistair Sterling. They exist in a different reality, one where people like me were disposable. I turned, my body feeling heavy and disconnected, and started for the door. "Alistair, that is quite enough." The voice came from a wingback chair in the corner of the room, a corner so deep in shadow I hadn't even noticed it was occupied. Slowly, a small, frail figure rose. It was Alara Sterling, Alistair's mother and the widow of the second Sterling. She was a relic from another era, a woman who moved with a quiet, rustling grace. She was rarely seen, a ghost in her own home, but her eyes, when they met mine, were sharp and lucid. They held a deep, sorrowful intelligence that her son completely lacked. "Mother," Alistair said, his tone thick with exasperation. "This doesn't concern you. It's a simple staffing matter." "It concerns me when you display the empathy of a block of granite," she replied, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight of command. She ignored her son and walked slowly toward me, her hand outstretched. In it, she held a battered old box. It was a wooden thing, maybe a foot long, with a tarnished brass latch. The wood was dark and scuffed, covered in the dings and scratches of a long, well-traveled life. It looked like something you'd find in a dusty attic, filled with forgotten junk. "Lily," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper as she drew close. She was one of the few who used my name. "I want you to have this." She pressed the box into my hands. It was heavier than it looked. I stared at it, confused. What was this? A parting gift, a box of junk. It felt like another layer of insult, a pittance offered to a beggar. Alistair scoffed from his desk, a short, ugly sound. "Mother, for heaven's sake, don't burden the girl with your sentimentality. She has to pack." Mrs. Sterling's grip on my arm tightened for a brief moment, her fingers surprisingly strong. Her eyes bored into mine. "He wanted it to be safe," she whispered, her voice so low I could barely hear it. "You'll keep it safe. Promise me." He. Who was he? Her late husband. Her mind was known to wander. I didn't know what to say. The entire situation felt surreal, a bizarre fever dream of cruelty and cryptic kindness. I just nodded numbly. "I promise." "Good girl," she said, patting my arm. She released me and retreated back to her throne in the shadows, her part in the strange play concluded. I stood there, clutching the ridiculous box, the weight of my life's collapse pressing down on me. I gave Alistair Sterling one last look. He had already forgotten I was there. I turned and walked out of the study, the heavy door clicking shut behind me, sealing off the only world I knew. I had 2 hours to erase myself. The drive away from the Sterling estate was a blur of green and grey through a film of unshed tears. I had packed my few belongings into my ancient, sputtering car, the security guard watching me with a mixture of pity and impatience. I didn't look back as I drove through the massive iron gates. I couldn't bear it. The estate, with its manicured lawns and towering oaks, receded in my rearview mirror like a paradise I had been exiled from. I drove for an hour, aimlessly, the humming of the tires on the asphalt, a dull mantra of my failure. The box sat on the passenger seat beside me, a silent, mocking companion. What was I supposed to do with it? A box of his mother's old keepsakes. It was absurd. Finally, the engine of my car, as if sensing the complete collapse of its owner's life, began to sputter and cough. It died with a final, pathetic shudder on the shoulder of a deserted country road, miles from anywhere. It was the final, comical straw. I was fired, homeless, and now stranded. I rested my forehead against the steering wheel and finally let the sobs come. They were ragged, ugly sounds torn from the deepest part of my chest, the culmination of years of suppressed fear and loneliness. I cried for the job I had lost, for the garden I would never see again, for the sheer, overwhelming terror of having absolutely nothing and nowhere to go. After the storm of grief passed, I was left with a hollow, ringing emptiness. My eyes fell on the box. It sat there, impassive. I looked at its scuffed surface, the grain of the dark wood worn smooth in places. With a surge of bitter, pointless anger, I grabbed it, my fingers fumbling with the stiff brass latch. I was going to see what final insult the Sterlings had sent me away with. I was going to look at it, and then I was going to leave it on the side of this God-forsaken road. The latch sprang open with a rusty creak. The inside of the box smelled of dust, cedar, and something else, something like dried lavender and time itself. It was filled, just as I had expected, with junk, a chaotic jumble of seemingly random objects. My fingers sifted through them, a catalogue of forgotten trifles. There were a half-dozen heavy, rusted iron nails, the kind used in old barn construction, their heads square and hammered. There was a small velvet pouch holding a collection of mismatched buttons, pearly white ones from a dress shirt, a heavy brass one from a military coat, a tiny, chipped porcelain one painted with a faded blue flower. I found a spool of thread with only a few yards of dusty silk remaining. A child's silver locket, tarnished black and empty. A dried, pressed flower, so fragile it threatened to turn to dust at my touch. A handful of smooth grey stones from a riverbed. It was a box of memories, but none of them were mine. It was the detritus of a long life, curated with no discernible logic. It was worthless. Utterly, completely, and totally worthless. This was Mrs. Sterling's idea of helping, giving a homeless 20-year-old a box of trash. The despair I'd felt earlier returned, but this time it was colder, sharper. It was the feeling of being the punchline to a joke you didn't even understand. I was about to slam the lid shut and follow through on my threat to abandon it when my fingers brushed against the bottom. The inside of the box was lined with a thin, faded piece of felt, the colour of moss. It was loose. My finger caught on an edge, and it peeled back easily. My heart gave a strange, fluttery little kick. Curiosity, a ghost of an emotion I thought had been extinguished, stirred within me. Underneath the felt, the wood of the box bottom looked different. It was a lighter colour, the grain running in the opposite direction. And there, near one edge, was a tiny, almost invisible seam. It wasn't a box. It was a puzzle. My hands started to tremble, not from despair now, but from a dawning electric anticipation. I ran my fingernail along the seam. It was perfectly joined. There was no notch, no handle, no obvious way to open it. I pressed on one side, then the other. Nothing. I thought back to the contents, the junk. Was it really junk, or was it a key? The nails, the heavy, rusted iron nails. They were out of place. Everything else was small, delicate, personal. The nails were industrial, coarse. I picked one up. Its tip was squared off, not pointed. I examined the false bottom again. Near one corner, almost hidden in the grain of the wood, was a tiny, perfectly round hole, no bigger than the head of a pin. It wasn't a nail hole. It was too clean. I took a deep breath, the air in the car suddenly feeling thick and heavy. I turned the iron nail around. The head was square, but the shaft was round. With trembling fingers, I inserted the tip of the nail into the tiny hole. It was a perfect fit. I pushed gently. At first, nothing happened. Then I felt a faint, internal click, like a pinball machine resetting. A section of the box's bottom popped up by a millimetre. My breath hitched. I slid my fingernail under the raised edge and lifted. A perfectly crafted, hidden compartment, about 1/2 inch deep, was revealed. The air that rose from it was different from the dusty scent of the main box. It smelled of old paper and leather, dry and clean and secret. And nestled inside, lying flat against the wood, was a single folded sheet of parchment. It wasn't paper. It was old, heavy, and yellowed with age, the edges feathered and soft. I unfolded it carefully, my heart hammering against my ribs. It was a map, a beautiful, intricate, hand-drawn map. The ink was faded brown, the script elegant and precise, and I recognized it instantly. It was a map of the Sterling estate. Every path, every grove of trees, the curve of the river, the outline of the main house, the formal gardens, the greenhouse. It was all there, rendered in meticulous detail. But there was more. Dotted across the landscape were a series of small, red X's. One was near the ancient oak tree by the river bend. Another was in the crumbling foundation of the old gatehouse. A third was marked deep within the overgrown woods at the far edge of the property, a place no one ever went. There were 7 X's in total, and at the bottom of the map, in the same elegant script, was a short, cryptic phrase, "Character is the only true currency." Below that was a signature. It wasn't Alistair Sterling's or his father's. It was a bold, decisive signature that I had seen once before, on the cornerstone of the old library. Alistair Sterling, the first, the grandfather, the man who had built it all. This wasn't a box of junk. This was a message, a test. Mrs. Sterling's words echoed in my head. He wanted it to be safe. You'll keep it safe. He, the grandfather, had hidden his real legacy. He hadn't trusted his own family with it. And his daughter-in-law, decades later, had chosen me to find it. The despair that had crippled me just moments before was burned away by a sudden, terrifying surge of adrenaline. I was fired. I was banished. I had been ordered never to return. But everything I needed, everything that mattered, was back there, hidden in plain sight. I had to go back. It was insane. It was trespassing. It was probably a felony. But for the first time in my life, I felt a sense of purpose that had nothing to do with being a good employee or staying out of trouble. It was the feeling of being chosen. I looked at the useless ignition, then at the map. I folded the parchment carefully and tucked it into my pocket. Then I got out of the car, locked the doors, and started walking back the way I came. The sun was beginning to set, and I knew the darkness would be my only ally. I was going back to the Sterling estate. I was going treasure hunting. The walk back took hours. The sun bled out of the sky, leaving behind streaks of bruised purple and orange before surrendering completely to the inky black of a moonless country night. My legs ached, and a blister was forming on my heel, but I barely noticed. My mind was a maelstrom of fear and exhilaration. Every passing set of headlights sent me diving into the ditch by the side of the road, my heart pounding with the terror of being discovered. I was a trespasser now, a ghost, haunting the edges of the world that had just cast me out. I reached the perimeter of the estate around midnight. The main gates were an impassable fortress of iron and surveillance cameras, but I had worked there for 2 years. I knew its secrets. I knew the section of the old stone wall on the western edge, hidden by a thicket of overgrown rhododendrons, where the mortar had crumbled away, leaving a gap just wide enough for a person to squeeze through. It was a spot I'd noted idly while clearing brush months ago, a minor flaw in the estate's perfect armor. Now, it was my way in. Slipping through the gap was like passing through a veil into another world. The air inside the estate grounds felt different, heavier, charged with memory and menace. The familiar sense of damp earth and night-blooming jasmine were now laced with the metallic tang of my own fear. Every snap of a twig under my worn boots sounded like a gunshot in the profound silence. I was an intruder in my own former home. I pulled out the map, using the faint light of my phone screen, shielded by my hand, to get my bearings. The first X was the closest, under the watchful eye of the Old Man. The Old Man was the name the staff had for the giant, gnarled oak tree that stood alone on a rise overlooking the river. It was ancient, its branches like twisted arms reaching for the sky. It was said that Alistair Sterling I had planned the entire estate while sitting under it. Moving through the darkness was slow and nerve-wracking. I kept to the shadows, my knowledge of the grounds my only guide. The main house was a distant behemoth, its windows dark save for a few lights in the upper floors where the family slept. I imagined Alistair Sterling in his silk pajamas, dreaming his empty, arrogant dreams, completely oblivious to the girl he had discarded creeping through his kingdom like a thief. The thought gave me a bitter spike of courage. I reached the oak tree, its massive silhouette a blot of deeper black against the night sky. It felt like standing at the foot of a god. Under the watchful eye. The phrase was poetic, but the grandfather seemed like a practical man. I circled the base of the trunk, which was as wide as my car. The ground was a tangle of thick exposed roots, like sleeping serpents. My phone's light scanned the area. Nothing, just dirt, moss, and decaying leaves. I reread the map. The X was placed precisely on the north side of the trunk. I went back to that spot and knelt, my hands probing the soil around the largest root. The earth was cool and damp. I dug with my fingers, the dirt packing under my nails. I dug for what felt like an eternity, my initial excitement giving way to a creeping dread. What if this was all a joke? A cruel, elaborate prank by a dying old woman? And then my fingers hit something hard. It wasn't a rock. It was flat and had a sharp, right-angled corner. My heart leaped into my throat. I dug faster, frantically, ignoring the scrape of grit against my skin. I clawed away the soil, revealing the top of a metal box. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of dark, heavy-gauge steel, and showed no signs of rust despite being buried for what must have been decades. It was sealed tight. There was no visible lock, but on the top was a small, circular indentation. I thought back to the junk box, the contents, the tarnished silver locket. It was the only other perfectly circular object. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get it out of my pocket. I opened the locket. It was empty, just 2 hollow halves. But the back of it... I turned it over. The back was a solid, flat disc. I pressed it into the indentation on the steel box. It fit perfectly. With a soft, satisfying shhh, a section of the box's lid slid aside, revealing a small keyhole. The key. What was the key? My mind raced. The nails? No, the buttons. I pulled out the small velvet pouch and emptied the buttons into my palm. The heavy brass one from a military coat. It wasn't a button. The shank on the back wasn't a loop for thread. It was square and notched, like the head of a winding key. I picked it up, my breath held tight in my chest. It felt impossibly important. I inserted the shank into the keyhole. It slid in with a smooth, oiled precision. I turned it. A heavy, internal tumbler clicked over, the sound echoing in the stillness of the night. The lid of the box was now loose. I lifted it. The air inside was dry and still. My phone's light fell upon the contents, and I gasped. The box was lined with oilcloth and packed to the brim with gold coins, not modern currency, but old ones. Double eagles, Krugerrands, British sovereigns. They gleamed with a deep, rich, buttery light, a pirate's treasure dreamed into reality. They felt heavy and real in my hand, their milled edges cool against my skin. Tucked in amongst them was a small, leather-wrapped bundle. I unwrapped it to find a handful of uncut gemstones, a raw diamond the size of my thumb, a deep blue sapphire, a fiery ruby. This was real. It was all real. I sank back on my heels, the enormity of it washing over me. This was more money than I had ever seen, more than I could have earned in 100 lifetimes of pruning roses. And the map showed 6 more locations. I quickly repacked the box, my mind working with a clarity I had never known. I couldn't carry this. It was too heavy, too risky. I had to hide it and come back for it. I reburied the box, carefully replacing the dirt and leaves, making it look as undisturbed as possible. 1 down, 6 to go. My next target was marked where the old world ended. The old gatehouse. It was a crumbling stone ruin on the eastern edge of the property, covered in ivy, abandoned for a century when the main road was moved. It was a place of decay and forgotten history. I made my way there, moving with a new confidence. I was no longer just a scared girl. I was on a mission. I was following a ghost's instructions. The ruin was even more spectral at night. The roof was gone, and the stone walls were skeletons against the star-dusted sky. The map's X was on the interior wall, near the base of what was once a grand fireplace. The clue was the stone that does not belong. I ran my hands over the cold, mossy stones of the hearth. They were all fieldstone, rough and rounded, except for one. Near the bottom, one stone was different. It was granite, perfectly square and smooth, its texture completely alien to the stones around it. It was a loose fit. I wedged my fingers into the cracks around it and pulled. It was heavy, but it slid out of the wall with a grating sound, revealing a dark, square cavity behind it. Inside was another steel box, identical to the first. I used the locket and the button key again, my movements practiced now. The lock clicked open. This box held no gold. It was filled with neat, tight stacks of paper, bearer bonds, dozens of them from companies I had never heard of, issued in the 1950s and 60s, and beneath them, bundles of old, large-denomination bills, the paper soft as cloth. I didn't know how much it was worth, but the sheer volume of it made my head spin. This was a different kind of wealth, silent, anonymous, and terrifyingly powerful. I resealed the box, slid the stone back into place, and took a deep, shaky breath. The grandfather hadn't just buried gold. He had buried a diversified portfolio in the ground. He had created a financial ark, hidden from the deluge of his own descendants' incompetence. I spent the rest of the night in a fugue state of adrenaline and discovery. I moved from one X to the next, a phantom moving through the sleeping estate. In the foundation of the abandoned greenhouse, under a loose flagstone, where life begins and ends, I found a box filled with rare stamps and a collection of exquisite antique jewelry, diamond necklaces, emerald rings, pearl earrings that glowed like captured moonlight. In the hollow of a lightning-scarred sycamore tree, a scar of fire, I found deeds to parcels of land in places that were now booming cities, all owned by a holding company with a name I didn't recognize. With each discovery, the scale of the grandfather's plan grew more staggering. This wasn't just a fortune. It was an empire in exile. He had systematically removed the most stable, untraceable, and valuable parts of his wealth from the official ledgers and buried them, waiting for a worthy successor. He had seen the rot in his own bloodline and had performed a kind of radical surgery, excising the heart of his legacy to save it. As dawn threatened to break, I had one location left, the final X, was the furthest, deep in the overgrown northern woods. The clue was the most personal, for the one who sees. It was marked on the map next to a small, hand-drawn sketch of a bench. I knew the spot. It was a simple stone bench on a small cliff overlooking the entire valley, a place with a breathtaking view. It was my favorite place on the entire estate, a spot I went to on my days off to eat my lunch and feel for a moment like I was on top of the world. Of course, he had chosen that spot. I reached the bench as the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the trees. The bench was simple, made of 2 stone supports and a thick slate slab. The X was directly under the seat. I knelt and looked. The underside of the slate was smooth, but in the very centre there was a keyhole. Not the small one for the button key, but a larger, more conventional one. I searched my pockets. I had used all the items from the junk box. The nails, the locket, the button. What was left? The spool of thread, the dried flour. It had to be something from the box. I thought back to the very first thing I'd touched, the rusty nails. I had dismissed them. But one of them... I pulled them out and looked at them in the growing light. One wasn't a nail. It was shaped like one, rusted and coarse like the others. But the head was subtly different, and the tip wasn't square. It was filed into the shape of a key. It was a masterful piece of camouflage. With a hand that was now steady and sure, I inserted the nail key into the lock under the bench. It turned with a deep, resonant thud. The entire slate slab of the bench seat shifted forward an inch. It wasn't a bench. It was the lid to a vault. Using all my strength, I slid the heavy slate slab aside. It moved on hidden, well-oiled runners, revealing a dark opening and a set of steep stone steps leading down into the earth. The air that rose up to meet me was cool, dry, and smelled of concrete and electricity. I took one last look at the waking world, the valley shrouded in morning mist below me. Then I switched on my phone's flashlight and descended into the darkness, into the heart of the Sterling legacy. The stone steps led down about 15 feet, ending at a heavy steel door, the kind you would see on a bank vault. There was no handle, only a small keypad and a biometric scanner that was dark and lifeless. For a terrifying moment, I thought my journey had ended here, at this impassable technological barrier. But then I saw it, etched into the steel next to the keypad. A small, perfect circle. The locket. I pressed the back of the silver locket against the scanner. It wasn't a fingerprint reader. It was a magnetic lock. The panel beeped once, and the keypad lit up. A prompt appeared. Character is the only true currency. It was the phrase from the map. It was a password. I typed the letters in carefully. CHARACTER. The screen flashed. Access granted. With a heavy sigh of pneumatics, the massive circular door swung inward, revealing what lay beyond. My phone's flashlight beam cut through the darkness, and I forgot to breathe. I was standing in a large, climate-controlled room. It was not a dusty cellar. It was a private museum, a bunker of astonishing wealth. The air was circulated by a low, almost silent hum, and the concrete walls were smooth and clean. Lined up against one wall were 5 vintage automobiles, each one a legend. A 1937 Bugatti Type 57, its French blue bodywork gleaming under a layer of fine dust. A cherry red 1962 Ferrari 250 GTO, a silver Mercedes-Benz 300 SL Gullwing, its iconic doors shut like folded wings. They were not just cars. They were masterpieces of engineering and art, each worth a fortune in its own right. Another wall was covered in what looked like sliding art racks. I pulled one out. It was a painting, an original Rembrandt, a dark, moody portrait of an old man that seemed to stare right through me. I slid it back and pulled another. A Jackson Pollock, a chaotic, vibrant explosion of colour, a Monet, a Degas, a Van Gogh. It was a collection that would be the envy of any museum in the world, all hidden here beneath a simple stone bench. In the centre of the room, there was a large metal desk. On its surface, clear of any dust, sat two things: a leather-bound ledger and a single thick envelope with my name, Lily Hart, written on it in that same familiar, elegant script. My name! The sight of it sent a shockwave through me. This wasn't a prize for some anonymous worthy finder. This was for me. But how? How could he have known my name decades before I was even born? My legs felt weak. I stumbled over to the desk and sank into the chair. I picked up the ledger first. It was an inventory. Every item in the vault, every coin in every cache, every bond, every deed, every painting, all meticulously catalogued with their estimated value at the time of their concealment and instructions for their liquidation. The final sum at the bottom of the last page was a number so large my brain couldn't fully process it. It was a figure that didn't just represent wealth, it represented power. The power to build cities, topple industries, to change the world. Then, with trembling hands, I picked up the envelope. I broke the wax seal, which was stamped with the image of an oak tree, and pulled out the folded pages within. It was a letter, dated 1978. To the one who sees, it began. If you are reading this, then my daughter-in-law, Alara, has succeeded. She has fulfilled the most important promise she ever made to me, to find a steward for my life's work. She has found you. And if she chose you, it is because she saw in you the qualities my own bloodline so tragically lacks: integrity, diligence, and a spirit unburdened by the corrosive disease of entitlement. My name is Alistair Sterling. I built an empire from nothing but grit and a vision. I believed that hard work was a moral imperative and that wealth was a responsibility, not a right. I tried to instill these values in my son, but I failed. He saw the fruits of my labor, but never understood the toil of the planting. He enjoyed the shade of the tree, but had no interest in caring for its roots. He raised his own son, my grandson, to be even worse, a peacock, proud of feathers he did not grow, a man who believes the world owes him tribute for the simple fact of his existence. I watched them, and I knew that to leave my true fortune in their hands would be to watch it be squandered, debased, and ultimately destroyed. The sterling fortune you see up there, in the world of light, it is a fraction, a comfortable cage to keep them occupied. It is enough to keep them rich, but not enough to give them the power to ruin the world with their foolishness. It is their inheritance, this. This is my legacy. I knew I could not choose a successor myself. How could I see into the future? So I devised a test. A series of locks that could not be broken by force, only by intellect and observation. I created a trail that would lead not to a single hoard, but to a deeper understanding of my philosophy. And I entrusted the final piece of the puzzle, the most important piece, to Alara. She was a good woman who married a weak man. She understood. I tasked her with finding the one person who deserved this. Someone who worked on the estate, who knew the land not as a possession but as a living thing. Someone who was overlooked, undervalued, and yet possessed a core of unshakable character. She was to watch and wait, for as long as it took. And what of your name on this envelope? That was Alara's final brilliant touch. The day she chose you, she came down here. She's the only other person who knows the way, and wrote your name on this letter. It was her way of telling my ghost that the search was over. The moment she handed you that box, the entire contents of this vault, and all the caches you have found along the way, legally transferred to a blind trust set up in 1978. The trust's sole beneficiary is the person designated on this letter. You, Lily Hart. It is all yours, untraceable, unchallengeable, your inheritance. Use it well. Do not make my mistakes. Do not let this wealth become a prison. Use it to build, to create, to nurture. The world is full of greedy, short-sighted men, like my grandson. It needs more gardeners, more people who are willing to tend to things that they may never see fully blossom. Character is the only true currency. You have proven you are rich in it. Now, you have the other kind as well. Yours, in trust. Alistair Sterling I. I read the letter 3 times, the words blurring through my tears. They were tears not of sorrow, but of a profound, soul-shaking validation. All my life I had felt invisible, worthless, a ward of the state, a disposable servant, but 2 people I had never truly known, a dead industrialist and a sad, silent old woman, had seen me. They had looked past my lowly position and seen my character, and they had judged it worthy. The first rays of sunlight were piercing the gloom of the vault from the open stairway. A new day was beginning. I folded the letter and placed it in my pocket, next to the map. I stood up and looked around the vault, at the cars, the art, the gold. It was not a treasure. It was a responsibility. It was a charge given to me across the decades. I walked up the stone steps and back into the morning light. The world looked different, sharper, more vibrant. The fear was gone, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. Alistair Sterling had fired his gardener. He had no idea he had just handed her the keys to his kingdom. The next few weeks were a blur of controlled, deliberate action. My first priority was to get away from the estate and secure my newfound assets. The grandfather's ledger was my Bible. It listed not only the inventory but also the name of a law firm in Zurich and a specific contact, a man named Mr. Brandt, the son of the original lawyer who had helped set up the trust. I sold the small bundle of raw gemstones from the first cache to a discreet dealer in the city, a transaction that netted me more money than I'd ever imagined holding at one time. It was my seed capital. With it, I bought a plane ticket to Switzerland, a new set of clothes, and a burner phone. I left my broken-down car on the side of that country road. It was a relic of a life that was no longer mine. Mr. Brandt was an elderly, impeccably dressed man, with kind eyes and the quiet efficiency of someone who has handled the secrets of the ultra-wealthy for a lifetime. He greeted me, not with suspicion, but with a paternal warmth that almost brought me to tears. He had been waiting for my arrival for 40 years. He showed me the original trust documents, signed by Alistair Sterling I. It was all exactly as the letter had described. My name, designated by Elara Sterling, made me the sole, incontrovertible beneficiary. We spent the next month liquidating. It was a masterclass in financial stealth. The bearer bonds were cashed in through a dozen different banks across Europe. The land deeds were transferred to a new series of shell corporations under my control. The rare stamps were sold at a private auction in Monaco. We moved slowly and carefully, converting the tangible, buried assets into a colossal, fluid, and utterly invisible fortune. The art and the cars were the trickiest. Mr. Brandt arranged for a specialized team, the kind that moves national treasures during wartime, to covertly empty the vault on the Sterling estate. They worked over a series of nights, using the cover of a geological survey on an adjacent property. The Rembrandt now hangs in my private study. The Bugatti is in a climate-controlled garage, a piece of history I could never bring myself to sell. I kept them as a reminder, not of their monetary value, but of the trust that had been placed in me, while my old life was being dismantled and my new one constructed in the quiet, carpeted offices of Zurich, the world of Alistair Sterling III was beginning to crumble. The grandfather had been a prophet. His grandson was a peacock, and a storm was coming. The global markets, which had been on a decade-long bull run, suddenly faltered. The tech bubble that had inflated much of the new sterling fortune popped with a spectacular bang. Alistair, overconfident and insulated from reality, had over-leveraged everything. He had taken out massive loans to fund speculative ventures, using the core family businesses as collateral. When the market turned, the calls came in. Margin calls, loan recalls. The corporate landscaping firm he had hired to replace me was one of the first things to go, a trivial cut, in a desperate attempt to stop the bleeding. The news reports were brutal. Sterling Industries on the brink of collapse. Alistair Sterling's golden empire tarnished. Generational wealth squandered in market downturn. I read them online from my simple but elegant new apartment in Geneva, a cup of tea in my hand, and felt a strange, detached pity. He wasn't a villain from a storybook. He was just a weak, arrogant man who had been given a test by his grandfather and had failed it spectacularly without ever knowing he was being graded. His downfall was swift and total. He was forced to sell assets at fire sale prices, the penthouse in New York, the villa in St. Bart's, the private jet. Finally, the last and most painful jewel in his tarnished crown went on the auction block, the Sterling estate itself. The historical home, the gardens I had poured my heart into, the land that held the empty, waiting vault. I spoke to Mr. Brandt. "I want to buy it," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "Are you sure? It holds some complicated memories." "It's not for the memories," I explained. "It's the foundation. The grandfather built his legacy from that land. It feels right that it should be the place where I begin to build mine." The purchase was made through another anonymous corporation. The once mighty Sterling estate was sold for a fraction of its worth to a mysterious foreign investment group. The news reported that the bankrupt Alistair Sterling had requested a meeting with the new owner, perhaps hoping to beg for a management position or a chance to live on as a tenant in his ancestral home. The request was granted. I flew back to America. I spent a week at the estate before the scheduled meeting, walking the grounds not as a servant, but as the master. The corporate landscapers had done their damage. The gardens were neat, sterile, and soulless. The intricate harmony of the flower beds was gone, replaced by monotonous, low-maintenance shrubs. My first act as the new owner was to fire them. I walked to the stone bench on the cliff, the entrance to the now empty vault. The view was just as beautiful. I wasn't the scared, heartbroken girl who used to eat her lunch here anymore. I was the one who saw. On the day of the meeting, I waited not in the dark, imposing study, but in the bright, airy solarium, a room filled with light and plants I had already started to rescue. I wore a simple, well-tailored linen dress and no jewelry. My power was not something I needed to display. At 10 o'clock, the same time he had fired me, the butler announced his arrival. "Mr. Alistair Sterling is here." I stood as he entered. The change in him was shocking. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. He was thinner. His expensive suit hung on him loosely, and his perfect hair seemed to have lost its luster. He looked 10 years older. He stared at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "You?" he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "You're the new owner. But you're the garden girl." "My name is Lily Hart," I said, my voice calm and even. "And yes, I am." He stood there for a long moment, his mind clearly struggling to process the impossible reality in front of him. The woman he had dismissed like a piece of trash, the girl he couldn't even be bothered to make eye contact with, was now the owner of his entire world. The gears were turning, but they were grinding against a truth too fantastic to comprehend. How? He finally managed, the word choked with a mixture of disbelief and dawning fury. Where did you get the money? Did you steal from us? Did you find something? His eyes darted around the room, as if expecting to see his family's stolen silver displayed on the shelves. I was given a gift, Mr. Sterling, I replied, my composure unshakable. I gestured to one of the wicker chairs. Please sit. He ignored the invitation, taking a step closer. His face was contorted in a mask of outrage. A gift? What gift? My mother. That day. She gave you that box of junk. What was in it? What did you do? He was connecting the dots, but the picture they formed was one he couldn't accept. It had to be theft. It had to be a crime. The alternative, that I had been chosen over him, was unthinkable. Your mother is a very wise woman, I said softly. She saw something in me that you overlooked. So did your grandfather. The mention of his grandfather made him recoil as if struck. My grandfather? What does he have to do with this? He's been dead for 40 years. He left a test, I explained, deciding in that moment to grant him the cold, hard truth he would never have given me. A way to ensure his real fortune, the bulk of his life's work, didn't end up in the hands of someone who would squander it. He hid it, and he left a map for someone worthy to find it. He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape. The color drained from his face. He finally understood. Not the mechanics of it, but the grand, humiliating truth. He hadn't just lost his fortune. He had never even possessed it. He had been living on an allowance, a trust fund baby playing with the corporate equivalent of a child's toy, while the real inheritance lay buried beneath his feet the entire time. The Cashes, he whispered, the words sounding like a curse. His mother, in her desperation and grief over their ruin, must have finally confessed the family secret she had kept for decades. She had told him about the legend of the grandfather's hidden wealth, a story he had likely dismissed as the ramblings of an old woman. Until now. They were real. It was all real. Yes, I confirmed, it was all very real. The anger in him collapsed, imploding into a pathetic, desperate heap. The proud billionaire was gone, replaced by a broken man. He stumbled forward and sank into the chair I had offered him, his head in his hands. It was mine. He mumbled into his palms. It was my birthright. He didn't think so, I said, my voice devoid of pity. He wrote that character is the only true currency. By his estimation, you were bankrupt long before the market turned. He looked up at me, his eyes swimming with a desperate, pleading light. The fury was gone, replaced by the groveling sycophancy of the truly defeated. Please, he begged, Lily, we were almost like family in a way. I lived here my whole life. This house, it's all I have left. You can't just take everything. I need your help. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. He was appealing to a sense of connection he had never acknowledged, begging for a handout from the girl he had rendered homeless without a second thought. He was using my name now, a courtesy he had never extended to me when I was his employee. I let the silence stretch, allowing his desperate plea to hang in the sun-drenched air between us. I walked over to the large glass doors that led out into the garden, my garden. I could see the spot where the heirloom roses were struggling to survive the landscaper's neglect. I would nurse them back to health. I would make things grow again. Finally, I turned back to him. My expression was not one of triumph or anger. It was one of finality. When you fired me, Mr. Sterling, I began, my voice level and calm. I had $217 to my name. I had nowhere to go. My housing was contingent on my employment here. When I asked what I was supposed to do, you told me, and I quote, "That is not my concern. You suggested security escort me from the premises to ensure a swift departure. I paused, letting our shared memory settle over him. He flinched, the recollection clearly painful in his current circumstances. You are a grown man, Mr. Sterling. You made a series of poor business decisions, and you lost your fortune. My fortune was a gift, earned by meeting a standard you failed to meet. What you do now, where you go from here, that is not my concern. I used his own words, his own cold, dismissive logic, and turned it back on him like a mirror. It was not revenge, it was justice. It was the natural order of things as his grandfather had designed it. He stared at me, speechless. There was nothing left to say, nothing left to beg for. He had been so thoroughly, completely outmaneuvered by a dead man, a sad old woman, and the girl he had fired. I believe you know the way out, I said, my voice softening just a fraction, a final, minute act of grace he did not deserve. There's no need to call security. He rose from the chair like an old man, his movements stiff and defeated. He didn't look at me again. He walked out of the solarium, his expensive shoes scuffing on the tile floor, the sound echoing his brokenness. I watched him go, a ghost in his own ancestral home, until he disappeared from view. A moment later, I heard the heavy front door open, and then close with a solid, definitive thud. The sound of a chapter ending, the sound of my future beginning. I stood alone in the quiet house, the sunlight warming my face. I was 20 years old. I was Lily Hart, and I was home. The past was locked out, and before me was an entire world to build, a garden to tend, a legacy to fulfill. And I had all the time and all the resources in the world to do it right,